Need a book back here. Just one over there. Good evening. Good to see everyone here this evening for our continuing study on premillennialism, dispensational premillennialism. As we have been studying after our study of the book of Revelation, we went into this study of premillennialism, and we've been going through it rather quickly to try to continue with one lesson per class. So it doesn't leave a lot of time for review at the beginning of the class, but I did want to point out a few of the major points that we have talked about. The word premillennialism itself, pre meaning before, millennial 1,000 years, and an ism is a belief. Premillennialism teaches that the second coming will occur before a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ from Jerusalem upon the earth. What we've looked at so far is, in lesson 1, we had an introduction into the premillennialism and how we would be approaching the study. Lesson 2 talked about a literal versus a spiritual interpretation. Lesson 3 talked about the promises to Abraham. The premillennialists believed that those promises were not fulfilled. The scriptures teach otherwise. The lesson 4 was restoration of Israel. Lesson 5, kingdom prophecies and the rejection of Jesus. Lesson 6, the kingdom/church established and Jesus on the throne. The premillennialists believe that the church is a plan B, that the kingdom couldn't be established because Jesus was rejected, so instead the Lord instituted the church as a space filler, if you will, until Jesus could come again to establish the kingdom. Again, this is not what we saw in our study of the scriptures. This is not what the scriptures teach. And then last class period, Leon talked at length about the rapture. Gave a good discussion about what is referred to as the rapture by the premillennialist, where they will tell you that there will be a rapture at some point where the righteous will be taken up and others will be left for a period that we'll talk about tonight called the tribulation, and that Jesus will come in the air, take these people up, and then he will come again at the end of the tribulation to reign on earth 1,000 years, which again is not what we see taught in the scriptures. We see that there is only a second coming. There's a first coming and a second coming that's taught, and not one that's in between there. And as Leon stressed, the fact that Jesus is sitting on the throne now, reigning over the kingdom, where the premillennialists will say that he is on God's throne, on the Lord's throne, but not on David's throne. And Leon showed the verses that indicate that God's throne and David's throne are the same thing. That we see Solomon sat on David's throne, and also in the parallel, Solomon sat on the Lord's throne. So with that, we move to tonight's study. As I said, there's not a lot of time for review as we're going into this. There is a chart I wanted to put up. It's a very simplistic version of the chart that we have in our book, but it does show that the premillennial idea is that there was Israel in the Old Testament, Jesus' death on the cross, and then what they consider to be the church age, which we know that the kingdom was established after Jesus' death. They will say that the kingdom was not established, it was the church age. Then they indicate there will be a rapture at some point. I'm only showing the pre-tribulation rapture here. There are 4 different beliefs about the rapture, but for simplicity, the rapture that they say will occur before a 7-year great tribulation, during which Israel returns, temple will be rebuilt, Israel key figure in tribulation, there will be an Antichrist, there will be a battle of Armageddon that will take place. Like I said, this is a simplistic chart. Jesus' second coming, at the time the battle would be taking place between Jesus and Satan at Armageddon, and then the 1,000-year reign, where Jesus physically reigns on earth 1,000 years, which we showed scripturally that the prophecies from the Old Testament say that that's not possible, that Jesus would not be able to reign in Jerusalem on the throne. He is reigning in heaven. And then after that, the judgment and the eternal state. Like I said, this is a very simple chart. The chart in our front of our books goes into much more detail. Looking at lesson 8, some of the quotes, and as our author has done throughout with every chapter of the book, every lesson, each point, we don't say what we think the premillennialists believe. We don't say what Jeff Archer thinks the premillennialists believe. We're using the actual writings and quotes from those who believe and stress this idea. Tim LaHaye being one of those who was a co-author of the Left Behind series. And his quote, "The reason the tribulation will be a holocaust of major proportions is because it combines the wrath of God, the fury of Satan, and the evil nature of man run wild." Continuing with the quote in the book, "Take the horror of every war since time began, throw in every natural disaster in recorded history, and cast off all restraint so that the unspeakable cruelty and hatred and injustice of man toward his fellow men can fully mature and compress all that into a period of 7 years. Even if you could imagine such a horror, it wouldn't approach the mind-boggling terror and turmoil of the tribulation." Charles Ryrie, another prolific author on the subject, says the nature of the tribulation: first, it is a unique period. Second, it is a period of judgment upon the nations. Thirdly, it will be a period of persecution of Israel. Fourthly, it will be a period of salvation. That's from his book, The Basis of the Premillennial Faith. The premillennialists believe that Revelation 6 through 19 and Matthew 24 describe the tribulation. We'll be examining Matthew 24 in some detail as we go into this study further tonight, particularly the first 35 verses or so of it. Referring to Matthew 24, Tim LaHaye wrote, The first thing our Lord wanted his disciples and us to know about the end times is that there will be many deceivers and false messiahs who lead people astray. Historically, the church age has seen many false religious teachers, but they will be even more pronounced just before the tribulation and increasingly throughout it. That's from his book, Charting the End Times. In reference to Matthew 24, verse 34, which says, Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Those things that Jesus spoke of and we'll go into detail about in the earlier verses of Matthew 24. That, to me, is a very plain statement that those that Jesus was talking to, some of those in that generation would not pass away before these things happened that he spoke of. Hal Lindsey, in his book, The Late Great Planet Earth, says, what generation? Obviously, in context, the generation that would see the signs, chief among them the rebirth of Israel. A generation in the Bible is something like 40 years. If this is a correct deduction, then within 40 years or so of 1948, all these things could take place. Many scholars who have studied Bible prophecy all their lives believe this is so. One problem we can see with that right off is that 40 years past 1948 was 1988, and that time passed many years back. So what generation? Is it obvious as to what he's saying? He says it's obviously the generation that would see the signs. Well, is it obvious? And it might be obvious if you've accepted a wrong or an incorrect interpretation of Matthew 24, the first part of it, then maybe that would be obvious then if you've accepted that invalid or wrong interpretation. But it's not. It's obviously not 40 years or so after Israel became a state again in 1948, because that would have meant it happened in 1988, which we know it didn't happen. And Leon went into detail last time, or the last class period, about how many people always seem to want to put a date on when this is going to happen, when it's very plainly told that Jesus' second coming, no one would know. No one will know when that time will be. So one additional quotation that I didn't make a chart for was what Tim LaHaye wrote, and I don't know if the book has it out of order or if it was intentionally done this way, but much confusion has resulted from many well-meaning people trying to identify the generation that will not pass away until all these take place. Some start this generation at verse 31 and believe that it's talking about the generation beginning at the time Israel became a nation in 1948. The passage of time, of course, has disproved that idea. And in this case, he's referring to that quote we just discussed from Hal Lindsey. It's better to interpret this verse in its context, that is, the generation that sees the events of the tribulation will also see the coming of Christ and the other events leading to the end of the age. As soon as Antichrist, which he says is, he looks as though he's put that as a singular word, Antichrist, and Israel sign a peace treaty, which he breaks in the middle of the tribulation, there will be 7 years until the coming of Christ. As we discussed in our previous studies when we talked about the 2 Peter, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, and then Revelation, does it say there's one Antichrist? Do the scriptures say there's one Antichrist? It says they are many. And at the time of the writings in the New Testament, they were already there. So that's an individual identified here with a capital A as Antichrist is not something we necessarily read about in Scripture. We see that Antichrist are many, and they were already there at the time of the writings. So that's the premillennial position. A good bit of it based on the book of Revelation, and a good bit of it based on Matthew chapter 24. So with that, let's look at Matthew chapter 24. 24:1, Jesus came out from the temple. This is the New American Standard Version. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down." As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Let me stop here and say, I don't see that as one question. Tell us, when will these things happen? When he's talking about one stone not being on another in the temple. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The premillennialists will put those together as one question, and the answer would follow. And Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes, but all these things merely are a beginning of birth pangs. Chapter 24, verse 9, then they will deliver you to tribulation, and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. Looking at the way Jeff has put these questions together, which of late we've not been able to get to everybody answering. I hope everybody's answering these questions at home before we get to class, because in order to get through the material, I've been the last few classes pulling the questions into this portion of the discussions. But at this point, if you look at the bottom of page 34, Jeff asked, was all of that fulfilled? And he gives quite a few verses in Acts and 1 Peter, and then says, etc., that show Acts 8, verse 1 talks about there was, on that day, a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the region. 9:23, and when many days had elapsed, the Jews plotted together to do away with him. And he was talking and arguing with the Hellenistic Jews, but they were attempting to put him to death. So they were attempting to and then 12, he mentions chapter 12, verse 2, and he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. So we see that Herod, at the Passover that's mentioned in 12:2, had James put to death. 13:45, but when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and began contradicting the things spoken by Paul, and they were blaspheming. So going through all of these, continuing on, we see that we have indication in the book of Acts that these things were fulfilled, that had been mentioned previously, that there would they would be hated, some would be killed, and they would be certainly persecuted as this time that's being discussed here approaches. And in Matthew 24:14, what we see is Jesus continues, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So did that happen? When did that happen? We see that in Acts 2, verse 4, they received power to speak in tongues, and they would use that to spread the gospel first in Jerusalem in the first 7 verses of Acts, and then to Judea and Samaria in 8 through 12, and then the remotest parts in Acts 13 through 28. So that was also fulfilled, and after that, then the end would come. Also, Jeff points out here, Colossians 1:23, if indeed you continue in the faith firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, am made a minister. So the gospel was preached as Jesus said it would be. The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So this did take place. It took place in the first century. Got a page out of order, excuse me. As we continue, as Jesus continued in his discussion, he said, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Daniel, let me read a note from Bob Walden's book that Sir, We Would See Jesus. There's a note in the section that discusses Matthew 24 that says, Daniel spoke of abominations that would make desolate in Daniel 9:27, 11:31, and 12:11. Daniel 9:27 and perhaps 12:11 seem to be the prophecy which Jesus refers. The other passages in Daniel refer to the desecration of the Jewish temple by Antiochus IV in 168 BC. There was more than one desecration of the temple in the years following this prediction by Jesus. The thing to which Jesus referred as something which would be is something that would be a warning, which would afford an opportunity for those who wish to leave Jerusalem to do so before the Romans cut off all escape. If you look at the parallel in Luke 21:20, he's likely referring to the coming of the Roman army itself. And Luke 21:20 says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. The King James says, and when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. So this discussion in Daniel, the abomination of desolation that Jesus refers to, looking at the parallel writings in Luke, we can tie that to Rome coming and laying siege to Jerusalem, which did occur in AD 70. Another indication, as Jesus continues his discussion in 24:16, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get things out that are in the house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. If this were Jesus coming, if it were a rapture, as the premillennialists describe, if this were a tribulation that is coming, what good would that do for the people to go to the mountains? Why would it matter if they go back to their homes or not, or go? It wouldn't make any difference. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for Jesus to say this if there wouldn't be a means of escape. So combining this with what is recorded by Luke, that armies would surround Jerusalem, this again appears to be more prophecy towards the destruction or the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, as Jesus was saying. Then Jesus actually uses the word tribulation here, for then there will be a great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Here talking about the elect, those that are the elect, those that will receive salvation, for their sake, the days were cut short so that everybody wasn't killed. Jeff did put a question in here. Does anybody know how many were killed? How many died in the destruction of Jerusalem?
You said how many? You mean how many Christians?
No, how many people? Does he say? He says how many died, so I didn't. For the sake of the elect, I took it that the Christians would not be in that number.
It says no flesh will be saved. I take it everybody, but that's the only way I know how to read it.
Yeah. I looked up Josephus, the historian, said that there were 1.1 million killed in the 143-day siege. But as we've said, Steve, were you talking about Christians when you said none? That for the sake of the elect, those days were cut short. If they hadn't have been cut short, then there would have been no life left.
It was, I think, if I understand correctly, the elect chose to leave before Rome actually started the siege.
Right.
There was no Christians actually killed.
They took Jesus' warning as a warning that we talked about just before that. When you see this day approaching, leave. Don't even bother to go back and get your stuff. Just get out before the Roman army surrounded and took siege against. But when he talks about there would be a great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, when Jeff put this question, how many died in the destruction, I took that to be an indication, and maybe I read it incorrectly, of that it was a great tribulation such has not occurred at the beginning until now. Is that, Steve, did you see it a different way?
I think it's certainly the case when Jesus is describing to the disciples when they will leave to start. This is going to get so bad there will never have been anything like this before. He also said there will never be anything like this. You will never see anything.
As there, yeah. In the previous times that Jerusalem was under siege, there wouldn't have been 1.1 million if Josephus has got a correct number here. Now, whether that's correct or not, it's certainly it would have been a lot of people. I've read other accounts that say anywhere from 600,000 to 1 million of the Jewish inhabitants were killed, and also another 97,000 were taken captive by the Roman army when they came in. And this was in, what I got was in Flavius Josephus' book, The Wars of the Jews, or History of the Destruction of Jerusalem. But as we've said, the Christians took Jesus' warning as a warning and left when they saw these things coming about. At least that's the way I saw Jeff's, because he put it right under the section talking about no destruction had been like that before, or no tribulation like that before, and none since. So with that, we're looking at a section of Jesus answering the first question. What will be the sign of these things these things happening? When he talks about the temple, no stone left on top on another. And then as he moves forward, he says, now learn the parable from the fig tree. When his branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. When I read this, I don't get the picture that he's talking about some generation thousands of years later that's going to see this. When you see the fig tree and its branches become tender and it puts forth leaves, you know summer's coming. So when you see the things I've just told you, you know to get out of Jerusalem, because something bad is about to happen that you've never seen before and will never be seen again. And this will take place before this generation passes. I put together a little chart, and again, let me read another section from Sir We Would See Jesus. As Bob and Sandra were talking or writing in this section, a note says in Luke 17:22-37, the same language is used to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. Therefore, we cannot assert that Matthew 24:34-44 is necessarily about the final judgment. It may concern the destruction of Jerusalem still. There are some who say the entire chapter of Matthew 24 is about the destruction of Jerusalem. Others will say that at the point of Well, I've said that between verse 34 and 35, there's a break there. There's a transition. Others say that may not be a transition point. And as Bob says, the language in the parallel versions are talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, use very similar wording to the second half of Matthew 24. Now, when you get to Matthew 25, we are talking about kingdom parables that do appear to be going forward, the end time discussion. But the chart that I put together here showing verses 1 through 33, we see signs. Jesus says these are signs, these are things that you can look for that will be happening. And then he says the generation will not pass away. In AD 70, we have the Roman siege of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. And then 35, he says heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And after that, no one knows. He talks about it. If the man of the house had known the thief was coming, he talks about it being like a thief in the night coming, and no man will know when this is going to happen. So I put the break point between 34 and 35. There may not be a clear break point like that. It may actually be a little earlier. It may be at a different place, but I still think that the latter part of Matthew 24 is talking about end times, where the earlier part is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Any comments or discussion about that? I'm not being dogmatic about it. It certainly is possible that it could be different, but what I do not see is the first part of Matthew 24 discussing end times and Jesus' second coming. Yes.
One thing to just make note of in the early part of 24, he keeps saying, you will see. He's talking to his disciples.
Right.
And he's saying, you will see this. You will see that you, and when we get to the latter part of chapter 24, he starts no one. So there are certain things regarding this conversation relative to the destruction where one stone will not be left on another, that you will be able to identify in terms of this is getting ready to happen. But then when it comes to, at least in my judgment, his discussion of the coming of the Son of Man and judgment, and at that point, no one knows when that will be. So I think one can kind of key on that a little bit and see a differentiation in terms of time frame.
Right. That's a good point that he does say you will see early on. That's a very good point. Now, like I said, this is Billy Reese's chart. I didn't get this from anybody else, so it may not be that clear, but I don't know, maybe it's the engineer in me. I like to see things with clear break points, so for my own benefit, I saw this as a good place for that transition. But like Bob and Sandra Waldron say, it may be that the whole chapter is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, but as Steve indicates, there's a different feel in the reading from the first part of the chapter to the latter part. Any other thoughts or comments? Now, I know we skipped a few verses that talk about the sun and the moon becoming dark. Other Old Testament writings, other writings about that type of symbolic wording generally talks about judgment and the idea that the Lord is bringing judgment on Jerusalem. The Lord is coming in judgment on Jerusalem in the early part of chapter 24, where the latter part is judgment on everyone. So with that, again, I think this is a point that says heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Jesus is making a point there that what he's saying take heed to it. He's giving a warning, and take heed to what he is saying there. And then he's saying, when I read it, I think he's saying that heaven and earth will pass away, which I think about what we just studied in Revelation about heaven and earth being burned up. So that was my interpretation here, that this is a point when he starts talking about end times. Any further discussion, comments? So with that, we've analyzed another point in the premillennial doctrine that it's a very key point in the doctrine, and within the ranks of the premillennialists, there is discussion and dissension about what this tribulation will take, what it will consist of, and when the rapture will take place during this tribulation. The predominant view of the premillennialists now is that it will take place before the tribulation. There are those that put it in the middle because of the 3.5 years that's discussed, put the rapture in the middle of it. But I think from all the reading I've done, most of the premillennialists today say that the rapture will take place, then this 7-year period, and then Jesus will return, Satan will be bound, and we'll have the 1,000-year reign on earth, which we'll go into later on in the book. And next time, I assume Leon will be back next week, and we'll continue on with the Battle of Armageddon in the apocalyptic literature as we have discussed in our Revelation study.
They have this tribulation